part of the print. So very often, most of the time actually, incomplete prints are found. I can't say most of the time, but a lot of the time, incomplete prints are found. So with the computer, trying to compare this to the computers, the computer that might try to analyze it itself without the forensic fingerprint analyst do their work, the computer can make a mistake. And they can get blotched a little bit, so the computer can make a mistake with that also. So whenever the computer comes out with its let's say 10 or so results, close matches, a person will always have to check it. You can't just trust the computer. So again, the computer will narrow down from millions to only 5 or 10, but you still have to take a look at what the computer does and what the computer's results are, and make sure that the bifurcations line up and the ridge endings and so on. And another major problem is, what if the person who committed the crime simply does not have his fingerprints on file? I mean, if people do the crime for the first time, how are they going to find? How are they going to match you to any of the fingerprints? I mean, they might fingerprint immigrants and people who are arrested, but if a person was never arrested, or is an immigrant, or has no other reason to have his fingerprints on file, having a fingerprint at the crime scene will simply not match it to anything. So these are, again, it's an excellent system, and it will match fingerprints very well. And a lot of crimes are solved by this system, but it's just not perfect, and you have to know the limitations. So as mentioned, you don't always find complete fingerprints. Now, how do you find fingerprints? Now, the obvious ones are that you can see them. I don't know if your mother ever told you, get your hands off the window, you're leaving prints on it. Yeah, sometimes prints are visible. This comes because the natural skin oil, as the finger presses on it, the ridges leave, they squeeze the oil more than the non-ridge parts, and this will leave a fingerprint. So you can see these. These are easy enough to lift off. You take a piece of cellophane tape, you put it on top, and you lift the cellophane tape, and the fingerprint is now on the cellophane tape. A better way might be to take a good picture of it as it is. But anyway, some fingerprints you can just see. There are other fingerprints that you might not think about. They're called plastic prints. They're impressions on clay or mud, if possible, depending on the consistency of the mud. You might see them, even though it's not like prints from the oil of the skin, but you can see them because they made an impression on some plastics, some yielding substance. And the most common fingerprints that they use and that they try to get are what they call the latent prints. Latent meaning hidden. You can't see them. The person put his fingers on the kitchen table, but you can't see them. Your mother never told you don't put your fingers on the kitchen table, but they can form fingerprints because your skin has natural oils, and if it presses on the table, it will leave some kind of fingerprint residue. You can't see it, but there are ways of getting them. And these prints are not just found on hard materials like glass, they're also found even on paper. And right, it's not easy to see fingerprints on paper, but there are ways of getting them. These latent fingerprints, if you can't see them, but you're pretty sure that in the course of the crime, the criminal touched this. What they do is they use fingerprint powder. That's a powder that they put on the fingerprint. They put on the place where they think the fingerprint is. The oils will attract the powder, and the oils will attract the powder, or will stick to the powder. The oils will stick to the powder. You blow away the rest of the powder, and you're left with the fingerprint. This is called like dusting for fingerprints. Okay, that's what they do. That they put dust on the area. The dust clings to the oil that the ridges left behind. Blow away the rest of it, and you'll have an outline of the fingerprint. So sometimes you don't know where they touched, but so you can just assume they touched around somewhere. Well, For that, you can use the RUVIS. That's a reflected ultraviolet imaging system. Ultraviolet stands for UV, stands for ultraviolet light. It is a typical abbreviation for ultraviolet light. UV light is an abbreviation, so remember that now because it's going to be used all the time. Anyway, so what this does, it sends a beam of light at especially a hard surface, which is reflected. Another kind of UV light is reflected, but it's reflected in the oils in the fingerprint residue. That's what gets reflected most in. There's a scope that can actually identify the light, this reflected light, and you can see fingerprints in that way. You can see that, oh, this must have been a fingerprint. There's fingerprint residue. Now, other things reflected also, but what reflects it in a certain way that the scope will see is the UV light that the fingerprint residue reflects. I mean, a lot of things reflect UV light, but the fingerprint residue reflects in a way that the scope will tell. So you can see whether there are fingerprints there. If it does detect that there must have been some kind of fingerprint, some person put their hand there or their fingers there, then you dust for fingerprints at that time. So the way it's done is, again, as mentioned, the fingerprint powder, they're brushed over the area, powder clings to the residue, and you have your visible print. You can remove it once you have this dusted fingerprint by putting tape down on this on the powder and lifting it off, and that gives you your fingerprint. And again, we have digital cameras. Always get pictures of this. For a light surface, you of course use a black powder so it shows up. But if it's a black powder, you don't use white because white does not show up as well as gray. So you want it darker, not white. If a fingerprint is found on a mirror, as your mother probably told you not to put your fingers on the mirror, you're gonna put the fingers on. Don't put your fingers on the mirror. You're gonna leave a fingerprint. So yeah, fingerprints are found on mirrors. They use a gray powder, not a black one, even though mirrors are not black or not. But use gray powder and not a black powder because sometimes when you photograph it, the surface of the mirror sometimes appears black. So black will not show up on it. So use a gray powder. The more modern method is use a magnetic powder. It's not a dust. It's a magnetic powder. Because when you put the powder on it, you got to brush the powder all over the area. And and again, when you brush it, it might smear things a little bit. So the magnetic powder does not need to be brushed. You just dump the magnetic powder on it, and you take a magnet and you suck up the rest. And you can even maneuver it using the magnet. Use the magnet to brush drag the powder back and forth over the suspected fingerprint area. And when you do, if there are fingerprints, they will stick to this magnetic powder. You suck them up with a magnet again, and whatever's left behind clinging to the fingerprint is the fingerprint outline. In addition, they don't just use ordinary powders. Again, more modern methods, not just ordinary powders. These powders are fluorescent, so that when they put them under a certain light, let's say a UV light, they will glow. So they show up very well when if they are actually fingerprints. So ordinary powder is brushed over it. The more modern method uses magnetic powder, so you don't have to use a physical brush. And the powders can be fluorescent, so that when they glow, the fingerprint will be very clear. However, sometimes even the powder doesn't allow the fingerprint to show up, or sometimes the powder just won't work. So sometimes what they do is they do iodine fuming. Now, iodine, it's an element.